It's a great honor and a pleasure to introduce Alan Cohen and Robert Dreyfuss tonight. A few months ago when Alan, maybe last year, when Alan first came to us after some years of absence, I had looked on the internet under Alan Cohen and found pages and pages of degrees and certifications and awards and White House this and U.S. Navy that, and one of the largest drug abuse prevention programs, if not the largest in the country for the U.S. Navy, I thought it was, and all kinds of kudos and factoids about Dr. Alan Cohen, clinical psychologist, Harvard graduate, and Baba lover. And today I looked those facts up again because I had downloaded them and put them on a piece of paper so that I could easily introduce Alan anytime he came. And when I went to print it out, I ran out of ink. But not before I had printed out just a little blurb about Robert. Now, Robert, I don't believe I've ever had the pleasure. I don't believe I ever had the pleasure of meeting Robert. I think most people know Robert's story. This is the famous Robert Dreyfuss who hitchhiked all across Europe and Iran and Turkey and arrived for the 1965 Sahavas, which had been canceled, and promptly knocked on Baba's door and got in. And all of us have read, or most of us have read that story, enjoyed it, but tonight we're going to hear the story firsthand from the man who lived it, hopefully. What I'd like to do just very briefly before I bring them on is to read from Lord Maher, one of the first references to Robert, and it's, for those who are interested in reading the full story, it's, I think, volume 19, around page 6,400. So Robert and Alan appear in Meher Baba's life relatively late in the story, but appear they do. And yeah, and this is the way that they appear. Actually, Alan was already in love with Meher Baba, and then along came, in the spring of 1965, a college senior at Boston University named Robert Neil Dreyfuss, age 22. And he was visiting his friend Alan Cohen at Harvard, who was studying in the Psychology and Social Relations department in an advanced graduate program. And on the door of Alan Cohen's office was a card with this quote from Meher Baba: "To penetrate into the essence of all being and significance, and to release the fragrance of that inner attainment for the guidance and benefit of others by expressing in the world of forms truth, love, purity, and beauty. This is the sole game which has any intrinsic or absolute worth. All other happenings, incidents, and attainments can, in and of themselves, have no lasting importance." Robert took a look at that, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I'd like to bring up Alan Cohen and Robert Dreyfuss. Wear this on this side so that he'll be audible. Maybe you can help.
Oh, he'll be audible. We know he will be audible. Hi. Well, ladies and gentlemen, not only our visitors from far away, Roanoke, Virginia, Rhode Island, District of Columbia, and even New Jersey, and knowing Robert, that perhaps millions will be watching and buying this videotape. To you also, in the future, this is a peek at the past. This is the 21st century, is it? Whatever. It is a delight for me to be back with you and to realize that many of you have not gotten to meet Robert, and to know that he was a very, very large part of the early days of Meher Baba's wild work in America. And he also has with him tonight a treasury of actual, authentic communications from Meher Baba. And we will try in the next couple of hours to weave a story or two that might bear upon the topic. What is the topic?
I don't know.
No, the topic
After
is...
our exhaustive rehearsals.
Yes, after our exhaustive rehearsals, some 30 years ago. The notion of the challenge, the blessing, and the humor of working for Meher Baba. And we, those of us dedicated to the avatar, do that in our own ways. And rather he works through us, but nonetheless, we go back now, we go back in history. It's, the calendar is zipping. Wait, it's the 1960s. Some of you may even remember the 1960s, a wild time of social unrest, of war, of turmoil, of the discovery of new paradigms of consciousness, of drugs, and of interesting lifestyles. And I would like, because I'm very curious, and I had been very curious, and Robert only whetted my appetite since he has a much better memory than I do, of what was going on back then, what ended up to be a strange and unusual triad of individuals who, in Boston and then in the rest of the country, would try to do a relatively impossible task, which was only made possible by divine intervention. Now, we must get Robert to the divine. I would like to ask what you were doing in, say, 1964.
I saw that doc here. 1964 was a time of great confusion and also a time of desperate searching. It was the, oh my goodness. Yes.
No! All right. All right.
The third.
All right. No, you're just on time.
The timing is impeccable.
Came all the way from Chicago.
From Chicago. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is definitely historic. Those watching on video, the slight disruption. This is our.
I'm very happy that you are here.
The entry of one Rick Chapman, ladies and gentlemen. And for the first time in, I would say,
20 years.
15 years.
89, wasn't it? 89, we had that recovery.
We have the program. But in terms of the possible presentation, the legendary presentations of
Mirazad was the last time.
Mirazad in
Mayor and Monty and
Like you.
everyone else.
This is for posterity. Since you're man in the middle, you'll get the honor.
I'm always the one.
It's omnidirectional.
You must be Angela.
Oh, yes. I'll smile for the camera.
Sorry to be late. It wasn't in the cards until very late.
Obviously.
Make a good drama.
That was. It's called a great entrance.
He always does this. Every year. We were, in fact, just beginning our reminiscence of around 1964. Robert was beginning to tell us where he was at that time.
I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts with my good friend Rick Chapman and Alan Cohen. That's when we all met,
Just like today.
just like today. But at that time, Rick and I were undergraduates. Alan was a graduate student. And Rick and I were the only two people we knew who were interested in spirituality. And then we met Alan at something called the Psychon Forum at Harvard. The Psychology of Consciousness Forum is what it was called. And there would be topics on abstruse subjects that had little to do with spirituality, but a lot to do with keeping things interesting. And we met because of a common interest in Gurdjieff and Sri Ramakrishna, Ramana Maharshi.
Oh, yes. One other thing.
Yes.
Potions and elixirs.
And herbs, potions, and elixirs.
Herbs, potions, and elixirs, yes.
Subtitle for today's venture. And so 64 was a great time of search for us. Vietnam, of course, was happening. The Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred. Things were going to hell in a handbasket, and none of us knew if we were going to survive the nuclear age. So it prompted a deep and abiding search for something lasting that made sense. And for us, it drew us into spirituality and also various herbs, potions, and elixirs as one of the means by which to hopefully apprehend and realize a deeper state of seeing things as they are. Rick and I, which Alan alluded to, and which actually George alluded to, went to visit Alan one time at his office in what was called the Ministry of Truth. And that's where we saw the "To Penetrate into the Essence" quote on Alan's door. And Alan and I walked in, and Rick and I walked in, and Alan had a universal message from the '63 World's Fair taped to the wall above his desk. And we went in, and I said, "Him again, who is he?" And Alan said, "He's Mayor Baba, he's a great spiritual master in India, and he's silent." And that was what drew me the most immediately, was because Lao Tzu said, "He who speaks does not know, he who knows does not speak." And he smiled all the time. So we asked if there were any books, and Alan got out a copy of The God Man and showed us photographs of Baba. And Rick and I went to the library immediately afterwards, and there was a copy of the...
One Baba book in the whole...
And I got it.
He still has it.
Phyllis Frederick had donated it.
And that was the God Man.
It was The God Man, yeah. I think you got the collected teachings of Ramana Maharshi.
I did. I was finishing off a couple of old sanskaras. Reading about Ramana Maharshi while Robert was sitting there going, and I'd say what, and he'd read some pithy quote or some detail of Baba's life. What? And you know, those first few pages of Purdam's God-Men are really fascinating. They're dense with they're a brilliant introduction to Baba's life, and by the time probably 3 or 4 views, and I think you were a Baba lover, and I was headed. Still, I had to, as I say, a few more sanskaras to expend. We were all Gurdjieff students.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
And I was still studying Hansa Yogananda in great depth and wavering commitment at this stage, but I had committed to a convocation in Los Angeles that summer. And when would you say this time was? What?
Spring, late spring.
Yeah, April or May?
Yeah, because when you got back to Boston, you had stopped in New York and met Harry Kenmore.
So I headed west with Baba in my heart and a commitment to go to this yoga convocation. And it was July then. because I kept silence in that convocation. They thought I was being very reverent about Yogananda. But I had stopped in San Francisco and gone to the Sufi Center on Sutter Street, where Carrie Harb, the then librarian, a slightly elderly lady, of course, gray-haired, and just what you'd expect, probably one door over at the Theosophical Library, wander in and just, so happy to see you. Madame Blavatsky, of course. It's a very, feeling was that there hadn't been many visitors on off nights.
To say the least.
We were quiet.
Because Baba had yet, kept the door closed. What it must have been like for all of those Baba lovers from the 40s and 50s and now into the 60s to have gotten God Speaks and the public shows and all this stuff, and still they were that small community that hadn't exploded with the joy of discovery of the avatar of the age. So I went in, and one thing I remember of your office that time we first visited was that there was a very small series of books. You had then, I think, about 4 books with intriguing titles. God Speaks. First exposure to the title of God Speaks. What's going on?
It's done.
And listen, humanity.
Listen, humanity.
And life at its best. And these titles were enough to make you a Baba lover. But I bought all the books they had, but one, because it wasn't by Baba, and I decided that for a broke person, buying all of these books was enough, and I didn't have much, if any, money left. But of course I went back the next day and got that other book, which was Wayfarers, and shipped them all back.
That's right.
And by the time I got back from California, Robert met my bus at the Boston bus station, drove his parents' car and rolled down the window as I walked out and said, "Baba is God." So as I had been wandering around on the West Coast and coming back with all these books, excited to share, he too had had his 2 weeks worth of discovery, and we pretty much all ended up in this stew together. So what were you doing studying the development of psychedelic drugs and the like at this time?
What do you know? By that time, what was it?
Summer of 60.
Well, just to interject for just a sec. When Rick got back, from the bus holiday, he said, they're going to show a movie next weekend in New York at Harry Kenmore's place. Do you want to go? And I said, of course. We never seen a film with Baba. So Rick and I hitchhiked from Boston to New York to see our first Baba movie in the house of a blind man who couldn't see it himself. And that's where we learned about the Savas and so forth. But please go on.
Well, of course, this would have been like 65, right, by now?
Yeah.
Right, at 65, so it's maybe 6 or 7 or 8 months after I had been in a little house, a little house in Millbrook, New York, populated with 40 other acid heads, and had had a LSD experience, being certified as an authentic psychedelic guide by the Leary Alpert people, which required that you took a high dose of LSD by yourself without going crazy. It helped not to go crazy anyway. And there was a peculiar message during that session. Suddenly my hand was grabbed and I wrote automatically something. A lot of things I wrote on LSD you wouldn't want to read, but this was good. It said, It said, "The way for you is love, trust, and unity."
Wow.
And I said, "What does that mean?" You know, it was fairly far out, but things were far out in those days. And of course, it was 2 days later when some of the same members of the New York group that Robert and Rick experienced at that movie probably were also in Woodstock showing a film of Meher Baba and having invited the Psychedelic ashram or community. Since some of the originators of the first light shows in America had gotten interested in Meher Baba, and their invitation was hip enough, even though it was films of a holy man. And that was the time when Darwin Shaw talked about Meher Baba and was on LSD when he was talking, so we thought, but no, he wasn't. But that was intriguing, and that was where I, in the era of the time, stole a book from the book table. In fact, I got urges right now. No, called Sparks, and realized that despite our explorations with Gurdjieff and yogis and God knows who else, this Meher Baba had summed up everything, both paragraphs. And of course that ultimately caused me to do the actual test, which was in those days to take some LSD and to go off and read then the discourses, which somebody just happened to have. In fact, it was a New York woman who adopted a foster child who ended up in the psychedelic group. Never found out who that woman was, but gave him the discourses as a graduation gift. Old copies. And that's when, as you might remember my story, I reached the 6th plane that day. And was validated.
Been there ever since.
Yeah, right. Was there for at least 2 weeks. Validated by a group of gypsy theatrical groups who claimed I was a god as I walked down the hill, from wildly sunburned from my experience, and when hundreds of children cheered as I walked by their campus at the Wasaic School for the Retarded.
He had no idea it was for the football game going on.
It was worse. They thought I was Paul McCartney. But I did share. And Rick and Robert, I had known me. I would have shared with them the exact prescription on how to get to the 6th plane. And I felt guilty and sent to the only Baba people I had known how to contact. There was this one universal message, and it was Myrtle Beach address, and I sent a letter saying, "Here's how you do it." And you Baba people really should know this. It's only fair. You take this amount of LSD or a little mescaline psilocybin, and you go to this chapter of the discourses, and about 15 minutes you'll be there. And
do we still have a copy of that letter?
They do in my,
I wish I had a copy of
They have it in Mozart. But tell them where you sent it.
I sent it to Kitty,
To Kitty.
and Kitty didn't know what to do with it. And so Kitty sent it to India, to Adi. And Adi really wasn't quite sure either. So apparently he interrupted Baba's seclusion. Now Baba knew, of course, how to answer the letter. And what was to be a hint of the later work, Baba was pretty clear, was very generous in saying that he was happy that I was studying God Speaks and everything, but that the 6th plane was a long way off. That she really couldn't get there that way. And about LSD being harmful mentally, spiritually, and physically. Anyway, that just about the time that Rick and Robert were talking about, I was still trying to integrate this insight, and certainly wouldn't have predicted what would happen next. And what would happen next is,
after Rick and I came down to New York to see our first Baba movie, that's when we learned that there was going to be a Savas in 1965 for Westerners, originally scheduled for May and then changed by Baba to Christmas time. And the people here, we met Fred and Ella and Harry, and they said there's going to be a flight to New York. It would be $600, as I remember,
Yeah.
for 10 days. And my first response was, spend all that money, go to India just for 10 days? It's ridiculous. I said, I'm going overland. So I can stretch it
save
out.
some money, right?
Much cheaper.
Much cheaper.
And I invited Rick to come, and Rick got an attack of conscience and decided to finish school instead.
He was like that, you know.
And
Aided and abetted by the fact that I was able to wangle a loan for $600 through the school, which was willing to help any student when they were trying to further their education. So I said, yes, listen, go, and we'll meet there.
right, and so what ensued, the full story is going to be for another time, because otherwise the whole evening would be gone. But briefly, I set off for India for the Savas, overland,
Mainly flying. There was
one-way charter to London,
There was a launching
a
pad.
one-way charter to London, and then thumb for the next 2.5 months. And basically, to cut it short, got to India, found out in Pune.
No, don't cut it short. In the meantime, as Robert was going through Istanbul, for example, I would get a postcard. See you in Nagar.
That's right.
But he didn't know what I now knew 2 weeks after he left, and we all knew that Savas had been canceled by Baba in a very solemn and extraordinarily moving statement about the weight and the pressure of his universal work, making it impossible for him to hold this Savas, but that he would see his lovers, old and new, sometime,
Somewhere, somehow.
somehow. And naturally, everyone was like, oh my God, those 2 weeks that we'd all signed up for that flight to India. But Robert was still Qatar, you know, see you in Nagar. All right, go ahead.
That's great.
Francis Babazan said to me that it was the classic tortoise and the hare. The tortoise came overland, and so in Pune, on my second day in India,
How long did it take you to hitchhike all the way?
2.5 months
2.5 months across Europe and
Asia, yeah.
Yeah. And you arrive at Pune.
And I arrive in Pune, and it's dark, and there's some, I found out about the Baba Center from someone I met at dinner. And he took me over there, and it was turning dark, and there was some men in the office adjacent to the new Pune Baba Center that Baba had just inaugurated in May. And I went in, and they looked at me, young Westerner, bearded, dusty, 22.
Ah, 20, okay.
And they said, yes, can we help you? And I said, well, this was the middle of November, 65, and the Savas was supposed to be at Christmas. So I'd seen the film of East West Gathering and how much work was involved in setting it up. Thought I could be of some help. So I said, I've come for the Savas, and the man said, surely you must be joking. I said, no. He said, well, you see, Baba has canceled the Savas. And I responded, surely you must be joking. I said, I've
Fine retort.
I've come halfway around the world overland for this. And he said, oh yes, and he reached into his desk drawer, took out a circular, and I had left the country September 1st. The Savas was canceled September 4th. So I didn't find out till I was in Pune, and I asked, where's Baba? And was told that Baba was in Meherzad, was in very strict seclusion, and wasn't seeing anyone. And I said, I must see him. And so the next morning, very early, I went to Naga from Pune, and after getting quite lost, found my way to Adi Keirani's office, where I'd been sent to. And Adi wanted to know what I was doing there. And told me the Baba was in seclusion, wasn't seeing anyone. I should go wash up and have some tea and talk. And while we were having a cup of chai, I looked out into the courtyard, and my knapsack was being tied onto the back of a motor scooter. And I said to Adi, what's this? He said, well, seeing as how you've come so far, the Mandali want to meet you. The Baba will not see you.
Yes.
And I said, whatever his will is. And I felt that if he wanted to see me, marvelous, and if not, it was his will, and I'd wait. You know, so anyways, I was shown into Mirzad over to the men's side, and shown a bench to sit on next to what is now Faluz's room. And the man came over, a soft-spoken, gentle man, sat down next to me on the bench and said, hello, brother, my name is Erich. What brings you to this bench?
Beautiful.
Yeah, so I told him my story, our story. And he said, wait here, I have some paperwork for Baba and I'll be right back. And he came back and with a huge smile on his face, he said, I have wonderful news for you. Baba will see you in the morning. He wants you to stay here tonight and sleep in the blue bus. So that afternoon, of course, I was thrilled, beyond measure. And that
Mainly because he fit in the blue bus.
That's true. That's true, too. Well, that afternoon, I was sitting in Erich's cabin, and the Mandali, who were in strict seclusion when Baba was in seclusion, were delighted to have a visitor to break up the silence. And they came over to meet me, and Cohen and Rano and Francis and Erich and several other people. And while I was telling my story, I mentioned Alan Cohen. I mentioned Rick, and I mentioned Alan. And Erich said, oh yes, Alan Cohen. And he said, just a minute. And he went out and he came back a couple of minutes later. He said, we got this letter from Kitty Davis. We can't escape.
Fantastic.
So he reads out this letter that Alan had written about saying, here I am on the sixth plane of consciousness.
Oh my God.
And where does spirituality fit into the panorama? And the Mandali had no idea. They never heard of LSD.
Oh.
So the first thing that Cohen, we said, well, what is this LSD stuff? And I just had this immediate mental image of a large snowball rolling downhill about to engulf me. So I mentioned...
What were you carrying at the time?
But I mentioned that in Boston, that we had called LSD reality capsules. And Governor just started cracking up laughing, saying only in the West.
Only in the West.
Just take a pill and 20 minutes later everything's pulsating with consciousness and feeling the oneness. That was hilarious. And then she asked, she said, have you taken this LSD? I said, yes. And what's it like? And I, being very careful to say that it was my experience that I would describe was subjective, very tentatively started to describe it. And that's when Erich stuck his head back in the door. He'd stepped out and looked at me and asked me, Baba wants to know if you'd like to see him now. As if I'd say, no, I'll wait till tomorrow. So that's how this all weaves in. And that's when the first messages that Baba gave about drugs, other than in private correspondence. The drugs are harmful physically, mentally, and spiritually, that they're delusion within illusion, that if God can be found in a pill, then God is not worthy of being God. And to my horror, instructed me to go back to the West and to spread his message about drugs to the young people there. And I had this immediate mental image of standing on the soapbox in the Haight-Ashbury saying, Mayor Baba says, but fortunately, with the help of these two guys, it worked out much, much more subtly and sanely. And when I got back,
When you got back, you of course were non-compass.
But don't
As if
come
that's
back yet,
changed.
because we're all sitting on the edge of our seat about the meeting.
maybe tomorrow.
Good.
When you came back, you brought messages from Baba to Alan and to myself.
And which I've got here.
So those were our first direct communication, or had you also already had a direct communication?
Well, indirect through Adi, as I kept asking stupid questions.
Yeah. Okay. So why don't you get yourself back to America before we turn into the Boston Baba voice?
That's true. That was us.
Now, what day
Let's
was
get down
that?
to your meeting with Baba. We're up to just the point.
That's what I say. Yeah,
What his impression was.
be there and then get yourself back to America after you.
This is a half an hour story. I'll give you the Reader's Digest version.
Condensation.
Condensation, yes. So Erich brought me over by the gates, past where Mani's office was in the little house, to Baba's bedroom. And Baba was seated on his bed. Erich brought me right to the bottom of the 3 stairs. And we stood there, he and I, while Baba was seated on his bed with a couple of the men mandali there. And you remember he had a sadra down to his waist, because it was very hot, it was November. And he just beamed at me and started gesturing, and the gestures were, I am happy to see you. And I remember thinking, he's happy to see me. And I looked tired and dusty, and I should have a hot bath, and I should read the section on Fana and Baka that day before the sunset. Have a good night's dinner, sleep well in the bus, and he'd see me in the morning. And I hadn't said a word, and Baba hadn't said a word, of course. So dialogue in silence. And what I saw, seeing Baba sitting there, was this extraordinary, effulgent light emanating from him in all directions, with his face at the center of it, beaming. And I had tears coursing down my cheeks as a physiological response to the intensity of the light, as well as the emotional complexity of the moment. And then Erich turned me around and brought me back over to the men's side. And I followed Baba's instructions. And the next morning, Erich indicated it was time for my darshan with Baba in Mandali Hall. Baba's seclusion was such that he stayed in his bedroom virtually all of the day, but would go to Mandali Hall first thing in the morning to meet with the Mandali and go over any important news, correspondence, when correspondence was still viable. And then he would go back to his bedroom for the remainder of the day and night. And so Baba came in, and I stood up, and Baba gestured for me to sit down. And he walked the length of the hall 2 or 3 times with his hand on Francis's arm, and then sat down in the chair that's still there in Mandali Hall. And I was shown a place to sit opposite Baba. And Baba started, the first gesture Baba made to me was this, to embrace him. So I got up and stood over his left side, and he reached up and embraced me and kissed me on both cheeks, and I embraced him and kissed him on both cheeks. And then he pointed to his feet and told me to bow down, which I did, and out of the corner of my eye, for those brief seconds, I saw the hem of his sadra, and the words came into my mind of hold fast to my daman. I reached up and took hold of it. And then I sat, Baba just for me to sit back down, and then this whole other talk ensued. But that's when those first statements about drugs were given. I did spend another night at Meherzad and slept on the bus again. Was given a tour of Mehrabad by Padre on Baba's direction. And at one point, during that day, Mani came over to me skipping. She was only in her late 40s then, and said, Baba wants to know what route you took to get here. So I gave him, I got my maps and drew the lines to the various countries and places. And she went off happily, skipping away, and came back about an hour later and said that she'd gone back to the women's quarters where Baba's room was. And all the ladies had gotten together with Baba in the living room. And she spread the maps out on the floor and said, Baba, he went here, and he went there, and he went here, and he went there. And Baba said, tell him I was with him all the way. And she gave me a handkerchief that was still damp that Baba had just wiped his face with and had told her to give to me. And so, with certain orders and directions, I started to come back to the West over a period of several weeks to fulfill Baba's orders to spread his message. When I got back, connected again with Rick and Alan, and that's when the Boston Baba Boys were born.
So, when did you get back? It was
just before Christmas.
Almost New Year's.
Yeah, between Christmas and New Year's.
Because I remember celebrating New Year's. I had been with my parents and came back, and we celebrated New Year's by my hearing this story in all its detail and glory in our apartment in Somerville.
Yeah, but that reminds me of a quick little aside. When I came back, I stayed with Alan at that house in Wellesley. People were involved with the with IFIF, with the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, as it was known. And
a name better than the organization, as it
But the telephone rang, and Alan said, just a minute. Yeah, he's here, just a minute. He said, Robert, it's for you. And it was Richard Alpert, a.k.a. Ramdas, who was on the West Coast with this couple, Steve and Barbara Durkee, who had started the Lama Foundation in New Mexico, and they were just about to take an acid trip. Baba was their guide. They had a picture of Baba over their mantle in the fireplace. And they had heard through Alan that this guy had gone to India and got all these messages from Baba about drugs, and they want to know. Alpert says, did you do that? He said, well, what did he say? So I told him word for word what Baba said, and his response was, are you sure? So I said, yes, Richard, I'm sure. And the other couple immediately stopped, because their guide said no. And Richard was a little more stubborn. But please, continue.
I was just going to ask, when you got back, that answered my question of how Alan first found out about all that you had experienced. And now it was December becoming January of 66. And it was in that next few months that the three of us went from searching to find out about Baba together to beginning to work together in implementing these directions that not only were given to you, but you carried back in part to us, and that had come back through different avenues to the three of us to spread Baba's message, in particular about drugs.
Yes,
I think I may have something. This is a cable from Baba to Rick, dated February 27th, 1966. The music of my love, singing from your heart, made me happy. Let your heartbeats be my song. I send my love to you and Robert, Meher Baba. And this was around the time that as I recall, we concocted the idea, I think it was actually primarily Alan's, of writing a letter to every college in the country that had its own newspaper, in which we wanted to state in one 8.5 by 11 page who Meher Baba is, who we are, and what may Baba has to say about drugs and why it's important. And we learned a hard lesson. You know how you've all read in the different biographies of Baba, where Baba put people together who didn't get along well, and being the much more mature Baba lovers than we are, we thought like how silly that, you know, this person couldn't clean up after herself.
Even putting people together who did get along well.
Yeah, exactly. And I would grind at them. We had 3 very different ideas about what to say in this letter. Very different. And we had to come to a common accord in order to fulfill the project, which we had already told Baba we were going to do. And one of the people that got involved at this time was drawn into this was Ivy Deuce. And in a letter dated April 21st of '66, which was sent to Mrs. Deuce, she says a New York Times article called "Colleges Warned to Curb Drug Use. U.S. asserts hallucinogens may harm students," end quote, was read to beloved Baba in Pune. After hearing the article, Baba wishes me to let you know, those concerned, that if the student world continues to indulge in the use of LSD, half of the USA would soon become mentally deranged. I'll make no comment here about the political situation. And then it says, Baba wishes Robert Dreyfuss, Alan Cohen, Rick Chapman, and others who have stopped taking LSD and such drugs to be, underlined, his apostles in this particular field, and to give lectures in college campuses and speak in social gatherings and meetings, quoting passages from God Speaks and other Baba literature on the experiences of the spiritual planes, and reading excerpts from letters from Baba to Dr. Richard Alpert and Alan Cohen, in which beloved Baba is emphatically against the use of LSD and ganja. Baba wants these, quote, Baba boys further to give articles and papers against the use of these drugs as based on information from Avatar Mayor Baba and from his writings and the discourses, God Speaks, etc. Baba said this is the best opportunity for Baba boys to do his work in the States and at the same time to be of help to their fellow beings in America. Their speeches and articles should be illuminating so as to turn the minds of the addicts and guide them to a proper understanding. And it goes on. But this was the beginning when the quote work for Baba, which Baba said at the time was the most important spiritual work that could be undertaken. And that this was the lead-in to all the energy that went into our trying to do our best to spread his message as he wished.
And the lead into a period that put 3 guys together that didn't have any experience. Maybe Alan was the senior member of this group and was in graduate school and was in fact an instructor, assistant professor. Is that correct?
TA, a teaching assistant.
Like but I mean, he was the only guy with a shred of maturity. Robert and I were 2 guys. I mean,
we were hopeless. We were hopeless.
Hopeless and helpless. But Baba had set us to this task, and there was a thrill associated with it. You can imagine the excitement. At this time, we were all convinced of Baba's infinite, unique reality. We all took him as our master. And we all would have answered that question on the psychological test, yes, that reads, "Are you an agent of God?"
That question.
And regardless of how daunting these challenges were. We did spend a lot longer than it should have taken to write this little article that all of us, as Robert points out, had different ideas about and had to meld and merge and edit. And I mean, any one of us would have had a hard enough time coming up with it, but three of us together just complicated it by some magnificent magnitude. And yet it did get done, and I don't remember all the other places that it got published, but the place that probably caught us most off guard, Christian Science Monitor, published the letter that we'd written. Oh my God, what's going on?
On the editorial page.
And then there were talks, some of them together, some of them individually, but it was a period of unparalleled excitement, because with Robert's having come back, having met Baba, having told his story, with us having this tangible link that Baba wanted something to be done and wanted us to do it, and with the promise and the expectation that we would see Baba again, somewhere, that this would be there. It was a period, you know, what the 60s are stereotypically considered to be, a very exciting period, the period of discovery. Of course, I don't know which portion of the population considers them like that, but our portion lived through it and were excited, thought it was exciting. And so these days, every single day, we'd wake up, we'd think of Baba, we'd think of Robert, we'd think of Alan, we'd think of each other, we'd do whatever we were doing, and then at some point, the term Boston Baba Boys came about.
And the segue is appropriate right here. Guru Prasad, Pune, May 14th, 1966. My dear Robert, your letter of May 9th, along with enclosures, was read to Baba. Baba was delighted and satisfied and proud of his dear Baba Boy's efforts in trying to carry out his directive regarding LSD. Quote, LSD, consciousness expansion or corrosion, end quote, was a very attractive caption. And I hope the program ended well, and that you three spoke convincingly by his grace. The letter sent to 550 college newspapers all over the country was well written, and Baba liked it. Mani wrote to Murshida this morning as follows. Erish has just received from Robert Dreyfuss copy of letter sent to college newspapers from Alan, Rick, and Robert. The subject is handled in a masterly manner, and its impact on the LSD devotees should be strong enough to stir up their image without unduly ruffling their ego. We all now await the result of the letter to the editors. Baba is directed to let you, Alan, and Rick, that he is happy with what you three are doing regarding LSD affair, and that he wants you three not to feel, underlined, nervous, but face people and students bravely and fearlessly. He is with you, his Baba Boys. He writes his warmest regards and much love. I close this with all best wishes for thundering success to the Baba Boys in the mission entrusted by the slippery and silent beloved. Erich.
Don't close that yet. Here's the most amazing part of all this. No damn laptop. Here's the disciple of the God-man. Yeah. If he wanted a copy of this thing, he wrote a second copy. Yeah. And correspondence wasn't just with Robert Dreyfuss through the 1960s or Alan Cohen. It was with hundreds and hundreds of people, and how they did then what they did. Baba Baba alone could energize and make happen. You heard the eloquence in Erich's letter. His comments so captured the challenge of the time and the excitement cum, daunting nature of it all. And yet, to me that just reminds me of how much they all accomplished. So the long story goes on and would go deep into the night, but the Boston Baba Boys became a few years later the Berkeley Baba Boys when we reconvened on the West Coast, and when that work, which really Alan led in the year 1966 and into 67, of spreading Baba's message about drugs, gained momentum. And I think that, And I think, Alan, you'd be the person to describe the feeling of the momentum as things went from that stage just described. I took a little leave of absence a few months later and went to India. And during that year in India, you were churning up quite a bit of trouble.
We want to get back to that time in India. As Robert suggested, we were knowing about it and enmeshed in the leaders of the psychedelic revolution at that time. And Robert actually remembers better than I. He was determined we had to go to Millbrook to straighten out. Tim Leary, right. Now, it is true that up to just before 64, when I heard about Baba, I saw the edges of the psychedelic delusion getting very slippery indeed. First in Mexico at our retreat, when we lost a CIA guy who wanted to take acid. Disappeared. It's probably in Iraq now. No. Found in Mexico City 4 weeks later, walking from door to door, walking from retail business to storefront saying, 2 plus 2 is 4, that's it! There was a slight loss of perspective. The other, the insanity of us, Larry challenging the Zihuatanejo professional baseball team to a game, and having the experience at the end of the game with the bases loaded and the Mexican team up and a pop fly in the infield. I was playing shortstop next to our third baseman. Everyone was high on something. And it was very tense because somehow the drugs had worn off and we had tied the Mexicans. They were not happy. The fly ball is coming down and the third baseman looks at me and says, "Which one should I catch?"
The CIA guy was better off.
I said, "Catch the one in the middle." He was hallucinating. The real ball hit him in the head. They won and lost. And then, just back in Millbrook, when, under the guidance of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, as a metaphor for the loss of the ego, our senior staff there had all lost their ego the last night. And I watched them fight over whose turn it was to do the dishes the next morning. It rang a bell. So, but we were not surprised. And yet, as indicated in that letter from Baba, he knew well the resistance that we were going to get. Because we were on the other side a couple of years ago. And everybody's subjective experience was so strong that to give a counter-argument was extremely difficult in those days. And as Rick said, we didn't have any credentials except the word hadn't been discovered yet. except as recovering acid heads. That was our claim to fame. And some knowledge about a new spiritual philosophy, a new guru in the age when there really weren't any gurus, when that was even a strange and foreign concept. Anyway,
I mean, then if you'd said guru, it would have evoked the image of the yogi lying on nails.
Exactly.
At most. Well, Robert remembers well our trip down to Millbrook, and I will let him tell because he does remember it better than I. He had less acid.
We took off in the early spring of '66 in your car. We drove to Woodstock and met the Rileys and the Otts, and went on to Millbrook, which was this big estate, rolling hills and huge lawns, where the psychedelic movement was born, where Leary lived. And we went there. It was quiet. I think just Leary and his daughter were there one day. And I had with me a package of blessed photos of Baba, which I placed on Leary's bed, one by one, until I covered his entire bed with it. And his response, he was very appreciative, and said what a beautiful face Baba had, and he said he got a warm spot for Baba and all this, and so I left the photos there for a while. And then we were having dinner, and he was really spun out about taking LSD every Friday night, I think for the Sabbath. And he had this fantasy about how eventually through continual research into self through LSD, that he would arrive at the genetic code that each of us was sprung from the infinite energy of the universe, or some nonsense like that. Anyway, so I asked him, I said, Tim, I said, even if you do this, I said, where does energy come from? He looked at me and he crossed his eyes and he slammed his fist on the table. He said, you're not ready to have children, nor are you ready to take LSD. I said, right on both counts. That's the way I remember it.
And during that time also, Baba was in touch either directly or indirectly with Richard Alpert, who he was very fond of, and Baba enters Richard Alpert's story later. But Rick went off on his Fulbright. Now, coincidentally, he chose India to go to. I mean, interested in Eastern civilization, having a degree in psychology. You were in Ahmedabad, right?
That's right.
Ahmedabad. Come back to that story in a second. Robert, I believe it was in 1966. Robert had no plans, right? At one point.
It's entirely possible.
Yes. And wrote a letter to Baba. Wrote a letter to Baba asking where he should go.
I had this idea of going to Maui.
And I knew Robert
Aim high.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I knew Robert was sending the letter, and I said, I was just finishing my PhD. This was the end of spring of '66. And I said, hey, Robert, ask for me too.
I don't remember this.
Yeah. And you probably got the letter.
I do actually.
No, not our letter, but he's got the response.
Right.
Which,
Continue.
well, the essence of he did write the letter, and Baba did write back, and basically
The essence was, at first, the first letter I got said, Baba felt it would be best to go to San Francisco to be near Rick and Alan. 2 days later, another letter came.
Such a painful reality caused another.
Caused another letter to come from Baba, saying Baba says it's fine to go to Maui. To take him with me wherever I go and share his message of love and truth to others.
Well, even before that.
But I ended up not going to Maui.
Even before that, Baba had written back saying, Robert had mentioned San Francisco.
That's right.
In one of his letters, and the response came back. Do you have that one?
I think so.
The essence was...
Yes. It's right here.
Okay, go ahead.
July 8th, 1966.
Oh, so this was where you were supposed to go.
Exactly. Beloved Baba was happy to hear your letter from Myrtle Beach Center. He says that if and when you have to move on from Boston, he would want you to definitely decide in favor of San Francisco. And if dear Alan Cohen, too, has to move on, Baba says that he, too, should decide in favor of San Francisco when the time comes for it. Beloved Baba sends his love and blessings to you and Alan.
That was a hint.
You were not yet involved in the Sufis, Alan?
No. So then I planned, as much as I could plan, I knew I had to go to San Francisco. Robert was going. Rick at that time was just pretty much getting ready. You were already in India, right?
What's the time?
This is July of 66.
Yeah.
Yes.
You were in India.
It's in India. And in that case, I didn't know how I was. Now, Robert could get anywhere, as you can see. He sticks out his thumb, he goes anywhere. But I was more conventional. I needed a job desperately, because we would be in Vietnam, which was not Baba's work at that time.
Not from us.
Not from us, for others. Bless the veterans. And I happened to be going back to Boston and stopped in and stayed over with a graduate school roommate who happened to be hosting one of his students who happened to tell me about a job she was not qualified for in the counseling center at Berkeley, and that they were holding interviews in New York that next day.
Wow.
So I drive up, I park in front of the hotel, I call from a phone booth to the hotel, I get this lady, and she said, well, I got one appointment left in 10 minutes, you can come. And I was going to try to fake it, but I didn't really have the energy to fake it. So I said, look, here's the deal, here's my academic credentials, now I have to tell you I've been through the whole LSD thing, this and that, but I hope you don't mind too much, And she was a very imposing conservative figure, and I thought, oh, I blew it, Bob will figure out something. I'm leaving, she says, okay, when can you start? And it turned out she wanted somebody to deal with the Berserklyites. And said to come in that fall. And so I got transplanted there. And Robert, you went out immediately?
What month was this?
Well, I think I showed up probably in November.
66?
Yeah.
No,
Maybe September.
I was back in Asia.
You were in Asia.
Yeah.
So now, in short order, the following happened. Robert was in Asia for about 7-8 months?
Closer to a year.
Almost a year. I was in India for 11 months, and Alan was in Berkeley, keeping the home fires burning, and beginning a lot of work with respect to spreading Baba's message about drugs. By this time, the message had grown. You know, the message came piecemeal. Some of the statements Baba made to you, a lot of the material that came in correspondence with Dick Alpert. Eventually, this formed the body of Baba's message about drugs. And in the more formal, down-to-earth way, Alan was carrying the torch in America. Robert Mick and Ursula Hamilton were carrying the torch across Asia, and I was in India on a Fulbright grant and eventually had the chance to meet Baba and then travel and visit a lot of Baba's centers and then come back in May of 1967. And if we have any chance at all, I don't know how late the rental goes on this place, but if we have any chance at all of closing out our story as a group, I think we need to come to about then, with a few catch-ups perhaps, but it was that summer of love, 1966, and moving from then on, that the energy that Baba was releasing became most manifest in the world, became most obvious to us as we would see people starting to fall in love with him. So why don't you take up from there, if that seems like the right place to carry on from. Does that seem a good spot?
Well, it actually was happening. I mean, Robert was in charge of all the transient hippies in Asia, of which there were a lot. Rick joined in some great adventures. Probably the classic was the Joe Pine Show in Southern California, which was a classic that I've told that story to this group. And had a one-on-one debate with Timothy Leary in Denver, wasn't it?
That's right.
Tell us that story.
Yes, Rick, tell that story.
Courtesy only of Alan's overloaded schedule. He was meant to be the foil for Tim Leary and said, I can't make it. I can't imagine what it was that was more exciting, but it had its karmic appropriateness. My parents lived in Denver.
Wow.
So this was the great opportunity for my parents to meet Tim Leary. No. To see their son, who had befuddled them a bit with all of this interest in Meher Baba and trips to the East and the like, to see him actually talk about Baba in a public way. So this particular talk took place at the Denver Arena, which was their hockey rink. It accommodated about 6,000 people, and the place was totally full.
Wow.
And I had met Leary on, I'm tempted to say, 2 other occasions. It may have just been one at that point, but he knew me. We had been part of a radio show in New York at one point.
Plus you'd been to Millbrook.
Yeah, but I didn't see him at that time. And it was just that one time. So behind the stage, as this event was coming about, it was one of these things that happens at colleges where students, put on a deal. They invited Tim Leary, who was very famous at the time. He was the psychedelic frontiersman, and these things were never quite as much fun unless they had some roadkill prospect, somebody that he was going to just turn into mincemeat. And they would, they'd gotten tired of having local sheriffs and all that kind of dumb shit stuff where they, oh, it's illegal, no sense of connection with modern aspirations and so on. So I was dressed in a sport coat and slacks, and Tim Leary was dressed as usual in his pajama kurta. And I saw him backstage, and he said, "Oh, Meher Baba," meaning I see you and I remember Meher Baba. And he said something about, I know he's right. And we embraced. We embraced, and I was always struck by that, and then Leary opened with his probably an hour's session, and it was so compelling. He was such a speaker, and he could speak quickly and flawlessly and seamlessly, switch subjects, and he was just mesmerizing. And his period came to the end, and I just felt like God Almighty. I had read about the Romans and the Christians, but this was too close for comfort. And I went out and talked about Baba's views. And of course, one of the things that was so exciting about the time is that there was always the feeling of Baba's, if you were doing it for Baba, I mean, no matter how inadequate you might be on your own, he was going to supply something there. And so there was a good give and take. And my dad, who was not a very mystical guy, had a newspaper clipping for the rest of his life on the office wall of his business, and I always appreciated that. So that kind of thing happened a lot. I know that Alan has given the number in the past, but I can't remember it, but in a given year he might give 200, 250 talks. I was in graduate school at the time and doing an absolutely terrible job of it. It was extremely hard to be in graduate school at that time because I had returned from India and meeting Baba, a year in India, and I was truly not in the groove yet. I have figured out in retrospect that there were some missing years, and that just wasn't quite hitting the floor. I don't know how to express it other than that. I went to India twice more while graduate school was on, leaving class just, for 2.5 weeks at a time. And really, at one point, my tutor called me in and said, "Why are you here?" And to not being here. And I said, "No, it's not a good idea for me to pursue this path. I must act interested, and I want to get through." And I did, and Baba sort of smoothed it over, and with the help of all of Baba's extra energy left over from dealing with universal crises, I did get through graduate school. But it was a time of immense activity, and talks were going on all the time. And when Robert came back from Asia, those talks intensified, and we would have all the access then was unparalleled. To just give you a picture, on the Berkeley campus, because some of us were students, you could reserve a hall. Just say we want to, not pay any money, you know how it is with students, you just say I'm signing up some program, and this hall might accommodate 400 people. And we would then just mimeograph, again this wasn't the time of computers, some goofy deal, LSD, mind expansion or corrosion,
LSD, mysticism, and Meher Baba.
That's right, and on, and how creative we were.
Yes, we were very.
And we'd look out, wouldn't be a seat, wouldn't be a place to stand, wouldn't be anything. The place would be full. That time isn't now. I've seen people spend real money advertising events for weeks at a time in preparation for Baba's 100th birthday or this thing or that thing. And 3 new people came and one of them thought it was a free dinner. It is a different time, but at that time people came, and out of those people Baba would harvest 40 or 50 at a time. Just whoosh, hi, you look like a good lot. Yeah, my familiar pals, and some of you may have been among them. We all were at that time. So it had an excitement to it that
tremendous. It had, the access was unbelievable, and the tension between knowing that you were roadkill at almost every gathering, and the fact that though Baba would get his work done, when would the humiliation happen? It was just inevitable, you know, because we had started reading about what the manga had been going through. And the work was shown to be very, very broad. I remember one case, like Rick had, there was a small Baba group at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And they had arranged at the last minute a little Baba talk, and they put up a couple of posters, and it was snowing. And somebody drove me up there, and I was thinking, you know, why don't we just take the 5 people and go out for coffee? That would be good. That would be good. And I arrived at the little classroom, and nobody was there. Nobody was there. But there was a little sign saying, the room has been changed, go to this room. I said, my God, let's take him to coffee. I'll treat. And I walked into the room, and there were 1,100 people in the biggest auditorium, a quarter of the entire campus, not knowing what they were coming to. There was another example. And it was a good one.
All the result of good titles, by the way.
Yes.
Remember that.
That's right. That was the one I got pied. Pie in my face. The other time was a time in Berkeley where we thought we'd get a great audience. And we had invited, at that time, a friend of ours from, a psychic and astrologer from Boston was visiting. We invited her also. And we had the regular publicist. We figured we rented a hall for 600. And about 30 people showed up this time. And yeah, there was some interest.
Couldn't she have predicted that?
Yeah. So afterwards, we're driving back, and I said, you know, Frances, I'm sorry, it may not have been exciting. Little panel, we expected a lot more people. She says, what do you mean? She says, the place was packed. What do you mean packed? She says, it was standing room only for basically social workers in the astral world who were working with teenagers who had drug problems. And so there wasn't room for the gross body.
Wonderful.
It was a good lesson. You never know who you're talking to.
What about that radio show that you and Robert did?
Which one?
Yeah.
Oh, well, when things went too smoothly, we could count on our BHAI, BHAI, which means brother, to help us out. I was doing a radio show in San Francisco, and the guy was actually being nice, which usually didn't happen because he didn't make good news. And the thing was going on, and Robert thought that I probably would run into trouble, so he'd listen. It was a call-in show, and he would either rescue me or make sure that there was a question about Mayor Baba if we didn't get into it. Well, we got into Mayor Baba, and so I was happy. The guy was really nice. And the phone rings, and we have a caller from San Francisco Bay Area, and I hear a voice saying, I have a question for Dr. Cohen. I said, oh, it's Dreyfuss. I said, oh, this is good. This is good. He says, I want to know from Dr. Cohen why. he says that there are always 5 perfect masters on earth at the same time. Why only 5? I said, Robert, I'm thinking this, what kind of friggin' question is that? And I could see him roaring at home, and I was stumbling around. Well, I mean, what he's talking about, oh my God. You know, and I botched it completely, so I'm going to kill him.
There are always little challenges.
Well, there was a time Rick and I were invited to be on a TV show in L.A. and went down to meet the moderator, who was known for being very acerbic. And we were invited to his house for dinner up in, I think it was Topanga Canyon.
Stan Borman?
I don't know who it was. And so he's wanting to sort of get to know us a day ahead of the program. So we tell him about our experience in India and Mayor Baba and all the stuff. And he's listening very attentively. He says, "That's a great story. You guys are going to really be great." Looks at us, he says, "Hey, you guys want some hash?" It was never dull. But
He was a friendly.
yeah, there are a couple of short quotes that are part of this time. October 30th, 67. Baba tells us with love about you and Alan and Bob and appears very splendid, very pleased with the work done by you in his name and in his love. Baba is happy that his dear Bob has again joined you and Alan and has got a job too. Baba directs me to convey his love to you. It's in capitals. Alan and Bob, and to let you know that he knows how well his dear lovers in the USA have been helping you and Alan and Bob to carry on the work entrusted to you by him. He is pleased and they are all blessed. Much love, Arch. A telegram to Alan. Your letter to Adi, 14-15 December, made me very happy. Stop. Baba time is fast approaching. My love to you, Rick and Bob. Mayor Baba in seclusion. So despite Baba's seclusion, we still had access because of the work that enabled all these various letters to come into being.
If I had anything to comment about it, now look at these Western Union copies, and of course they're a thing of a different age with email now. Robert Allen and I had an opportunity that wasn't exclusive but was extremely special in the middle and late 60s and 70s. And we all witnessed how thoroughly it was Baba's wish and will that energized and activated this work, because despite all of our eagerness and interest, that fire was turned down ever so gradually. The access would change. There weren't so many opportunities. And on. We saw how that the intensity of that time was his, in short. Right. And it had its timing. And it will come again. That cycle of his work in waves like that repeats over and over, endlessly. And the excitement of being part of that work was something that we were drawn into unexpectedly. None of us came to Baba knowing or thinking we would be working in his cause. But I don't think that any of us would ever trade a moment of that opportunity that he gave, and that he gave really quite broadly. I would only add that at this time that opportunity remains in force. And as you see, aging Boston Baba boys who became the Berkeley Baba boys, now how many years later? 30 years later, the befuddled Baba boys. Whatever it is, we're not a step closer to God realization, for God's sake.
You're just veiled, you don't know.
Can't even, he's adult.
Can't even count. But the amazing thing about Baba's declaration of his advent and its intimacy. After I drop the body, I will be as if physically present for 100 years and a little more. That access is there to be taken and given. There will be many more instances, although the drama that is portrayed in these correspondences, the most precious, and the memories and the tales, seems frozen at a time that can never be repeated. And of course, as Begin the Beguine so aptly says, to live it again is beyond all endeavor. But there will be new times and new times that have just as much thrill and intimacy with the beloved. We still have to see St. Paul appear to carry his message to the masses. This time, of course, it will probably be St. Pauline, the way Baba has been working with women in the West. And we need our own show.
Yes.
We've got to have something. It's been thinking, it seems to me, that we need, as we get more and more Baba lovers in America, we need our own television show.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of something along the
Jeopardy.
I'm thinking of American Idol.
American Idol.
Survivor.
Wheel of Reality.
In which, Baba lovers are actually graded and critiqued by how well they recite the Parvardagar prayer, how many books they've read. But the time will come when all that will be a matter of course, and this is the time that is so unstructured, so intimate, so direct contact with him, the opportunity to be his and have him be yours, unparalleled. Whatever it is, it's not his fault, but as the Advent ages, the weight of Maya's force, which he gives for the game, is such that it ceases to be possible for most people to have that close sense. And so we have churches and mosques and temples, and we have people who purvey the message of God and the presence of God to the masses. We have a different time now. It is most spectacularly wonderful. And even though this time can't be reprised, something else is now. Something else is now. And we have that opportunity. So keep it in mind. I'm sure that Baba is well ahead of all of our wildest guesses.
But this is a place that he has chosen. Baba groups around the country and around the nation to be a place in which that intimacy can be experienced as a group, and also an avenue for access for new people. The challenge, and it's funny because I was talking to Robert over dinner, I had the same hit tonight, that this is a special time in that the Meher Baba people haven't blown it yet. And if you look, I don't want to get...
What was that, plenty of time?
It was time, he said.
And if you look historically, there seems to be a gap between the passing of the Avatar and when people start to restructure the institutionalization of altered truth. When people are having visions and they become the only interpreter, and you get the Shiites and the Sunnites and it is still that time when the Meher Baba church, when the Meher Baba religion ain't here. And it's a special time because to be able to break through that in the future would be very, very difficult. And it may be that this generation of Baba lovers can generate such a presence and such a flexibility and such an acceptance and such a love for diversity and a love for the different ways that people would come to Baba that it can be preserved. And that would be the new humanity. We know what the old humanity looks like. And that is very special work now. It's not as dramatic, perhaps, until the TV show comes, but it is absolutely crucial. And with the play of egos, it's very, very difficult to hold back that temptation to jump on, this is right. This is what he meant. This is what the breaking of the silence is. I had a vision. Baba has spoken to me. These are the words. All very powerful. As powerful as LSD. And as subjective. And Baba knew that. He set it up. His words are there. He understood. He said he was here not, in fact, to teach but to awaken. And that ability for this relatively teeny group of avatar followers given the world. And it will remain teeny for quite a while.
And that's the mystery and the miracle of it.
That's right.
I mean, look at the struggle. Here's New York City, graced by meetings held by Narina Machabelli, Fred Miller Winterfeld, Harry Kenmore, a long line of hallowed names. Margaret Krask lived here for years.
Ivy Deuce.
Pardon?
Ivy Deuce lived here.
Ivy Deuce was here, although her most of her activity wasn't associated with New York as much. The thing that I'm saying is that here,
Adele Walker was
here, Los Angeles, and Berkeley, and then you start quickly running out of organized Baba groups, and look at what the situation is. We're meeting in the middle of 3 doors. And it feels so frustrating that it's not our place, and how the hell can you afford our place, and we've only got so many people, and listen, you don't have any idea how hard it is just to get things ready and schlep the stuff back and forth and do all that's required to do this. And we do know, because we've done it. We have run meetings and been in the midst of this activity. And it is Baba's way that for a period of time, things remain intimate, informal, almost against one's will. The big bequests that may enable, the place of your own and all that responsibility and the formalization of your organization beyond your wildest imagination are the things that turn the tide. And this period is one that, while it feels often dry and tedious to try to figure out what to do every time, and this meeting format only works every 17th time is exciting, and the rest of the time I see the same people, and oh God, he's going to talk again, and all this stuff goes on. And the only feeling I have about it is make it your own. Have so much longing to cherish the time that is so intimate with him, that behind the curtain of our vision, he is with us, as if physically present right now, that we make anything, a group of 2 or a group of 40 or whatever the occasion is, a chance to celebrate. And we let every aspect of our longing to please him and be with him find some expression. Most of all, it seems to me, the words that Robert started his meeting reaching for Baba's Daman, and the last words that Baba gave to me were, the most important thing for you is to hold fast to my Daman. Do you know what holding the Daman means, he asked? And fortunately, it was a rhetorical question, saving lots of time and probably some embarrassment. He said, it means obeying me implicitly, doing everything I say. And then finished with the words, I am God. I am truth. We have to hold on to him in a way now that we find ever more difficult because of the weight of Maya. Who imagined when you first came to Baba that in the succeeding years, after the honeymoon of discovering him, things would be as hard as they were, as tedious, as routine as they might have become? Despite the highest highs, there is the everydayness of it all. We have to hang on to him. We have to hold on to him and find ways to do it. And one of the ways that strikes me most is something like what Alan just expressed. We have to hold on to each other, because one of the most palpable and tangible expressions of our beloved is in each of us. We have to support each other, care for each other, and find him there. And in that effort, that ember will stay aglow until his breath slips out, and you'll see another fire, and you won't know what happened. We didn't know what happened in the 60s. When, as Alan described, walking into a room, oh, there's nobody here, probably saying, thank God, I didn't really know what I was going to say anyway. And then the next door is 1,100 people. That will happen again.
Meanwhile, the Mandali are grateful that it hasn't happened yet, because otherwise they'd be more overwhelmed than they already are. So they're very happy with Baba keeping things very slow and quiet, and pray that it'll last as long as they continue to breathe. But it reminds me of an amusing story involving the three of us. This is, I think, the third time we've ever gotten together like this. But the first time, we gave a talk in Berkeley together. We were invited to do so by the Baba group and devised a different way of giving a talk. We had a show sitting in the front row with a bell. One of us would start to talk eloquently like Rick, and at exactly 1 minute, the bell would ring.
Bing, bing, bing.
And the person sitting next to him, one of us, would have to, mid-sentence, whoever is not using his last word, start to say something else.
Up on the word.
And continue in anything about Baba that we wanted. And then 1 minute later, ding, third person, and we did this for an entire talk.
That's why it only happens once every.
That's right.
700 years about
February 14th, 1968, Valentine's Day.
Valentine's.
Cable from Meher Baba to Rick. Received an announcement from Meher Baba in seclusion. Report made me very happy. Account of 3-speaker experiment amused me in my seclusion. My love to you, Alan, Bob. Stop my love blessing to all who hear of my love through you three. Meher Baba. So, the little things we do resonate long after the action itself has ceased. And so 40 years later, we're still at it.
And I hear the bell now.
Yes.
Is that the caravan?
No matter how well or unwell we got along, we haven't got divorced yet. So still, don't you think that Kitty would say, you know, people have an attention span of only so much.
But maybe they'd like to ask a few questions.
Yeah.
This is the perfect time.
Is there time for you to briefly tell about your meeting about this?
I think probably not. Briefly, I'll tell about it in 2 minutes, because tonight there was a different format, and you know, each one of us up here could take a long time out of the night, but I did get to meet Baba during that trip to India. I don't want to act as if everyone has heard that story, because perhaps there are some people here who have not. But it was, of course, the highlight of my life, the moment of my life, and it was a brief one-day meeting in India that also came unexpectedly, because I was in India as a Fulbright student with design. I had a purpose, but it wasn't to go there and meet Baba. Baba was in seclusion. I knew that. Just as Robert waited outside India at Baba's instruction, waiting for Baba's seclusion to end, I was in India during his seclusion, knowing that there wasn't a chance to see him until he should end that seclusion, or, as it turned out, invite me to come. And he did, for a very brief meeting on August 15th, 1966. And that meeting took place in the exact same spot that Robert met with Baba in Marazad in Mundley Hall. And Baba's presence was so remarkable that it doesn't yield to expression. You see him in the films. There's something in person that transcends all of that, and it even transcends my memory. All I remember is that it transcended all that I can express. And the intimacy with which he greeted me, you have all seen and heard about. Robert described it as well. For, you know, in a world of gurus who like to keep people at foot level, he embraced me and kissed me, but more than that, treated me just with the most informal, direct discussion. He asked if I'd met Francis Brabazon at some point during the discussion. I said no, he had me do so. He had Francis read a ghazal, and then Baba himself closed his eyes and kept that rhythm that he could perceive in the ghazal on the arms of his chair. And at one point just rolled over, opened his eyes, looked at me, and as if to say, wasn't that something? And just sharing in those most personal and unobstructed ways. There was never any sense that the discussion was slowed down or hindered by his silence. Erich's recitation of what Baba had of his gestures was flawless, and I'm sure that any gap was well filled in by Baba's presence, so that I didn't notice anything. But at the end, I told you that he said the most important thing was to hold fast to his Dhamma, and in the middle of that time, he said the one thing that has become the theme that I identified with that meeting. I had talked to him about how excited I was to be there, how thrilling the moment was, and how many people wanted to see him at this time. Lovers, west and east, had all, you're going to India, Baba's in seclusion. And he said, pay no attention to the thoughts of the mind. He said, we had just had a little interchange, and the part that I want to express takes up here. Pay no attention to the thoughts of the mind. It's the nature of the mind to have every kind of thought, good and bad. You must long for me with your heart. At which point, forever onward, he made quite clear that no thought of the mind had any currency with the avatar, good or bad. You must long for me with your heart. And when he said that, he looked puzzled. And he said, where will you get this longing? And I now know, how many years later, 35 years later, that the reason for the avatar himself looking so puzzled is that it's damned hard to find that longing that Mira had and St. Francis had and that the great ones had and that obviously drew every one of his Mandali to be in his circle doesn't come cheaply. But it's the only door of access to him. And he said, by loving me. You must strive to see me as I really am, he said. And with that, a short summary of that meeting. So, everyone has stories to tell. This, though, was a celebration of 3 guys lucky beyond their wildest karma. Opportunity to feel engaged by the avatar of the age and to have his intimate contact in message, in presence. So many treasured opportunities, but not least among them, the chance to be with his lovers. You know, I don't know what each of our personalities would have foretold for us otherwise, but I know that we would never have had the opportunity to know and meet as many of his lovers had he not made it possible in this way. And there is so much of Baba in each of his lovers. The tendency of human nature is to find fault. Oh, look at him, look at her. Oh, bugs me like I can't. But the reality is that each one carries some of that miracle. Each one has been blessed with that awareness that, as Alan points out, is so limited on the planet Earth right now. How many people know the avatar of the age? And so that's partly why I say we have to trust when he says, you know, believe in the lovers of God, and to learn that next level of support and care. Because I think that it's not for nothing that he in his message, how you treat others is where you'll find me. Real happiness lies in making others happy. I think the biggest lesson I've learned in 30-some years is how those words that sound so real take such a long time to digest.
And bear fruit.
And bear fruit. Other?
Yeah. Hi. I've known or met each of you different times over the years, and but tonight I feel almost as if Bob was giving us like a reunion of the Beatles or the Marx Brothers.
It's closer to the Marx Brothers. Okay, maybe the Three Stooges.
Just to say how much, I think on behalf of everyone, how much we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Will you be with us tomorrow?
I will not be with you tomorrow. I stole some time from... The story was Allah said, come, fly first class, stay at Plaza, do what you must, come!
Because I told Baba, please, you said me, no, I will not come, blah, blah, blah. After that I said, Baba, please, Baba, if you are God, please bring him to
Wow.
this meeting.
The fourth Beatle.
Baba, please because he used to tell.
So I had a project in Chicago this week.
Super.
And it just so happens that my wife's parents are in New Jersey, so I said, listen, killing two birds with one stone, plane flight. So she's there, I'm here, and we're
Bob
headed
is
back.
here.
Yeah.
He proved that he's God.
Yeah. He proved that you're the one we're coming to when we need a prayer answer.
And then like Allah.
Question.
How the students, when you give this speech about Baba's statement, how they respond to that? Do you have any story about how they respond to that, statement that went against what they were doing at that time?
About Baba's being God, about his statements about drugs?
About the drugs, about the drugs.
Here's the guy with the stories.
Well, that's another, to make it 2 minutes.
We have time.
2 examples. No. But some you've heard. A lot of people didn't want to hear it. In the early days, the message was much more on target on drugs, and we slipped Baba's name in. As the days grew later, as Rick and Robert suggested, and even the messages from Baba came, he talked more about spreading his message, not just about drugs, but his message of love and truth. For some of them, the lights went on, and those were a lot of people now consider themselves Baba lovers, because they ironically could identify with the limitations of drugs, perhaps more than people who hadn't taken them. Really. Because we used to be able to get people really paranoid. Remember, talking about astral entities and holes and auras and stuff. And if you had any quotes at all from spiritual masters, went a long way. Doesn't get such a long way now. The 2 instances I remember, my classic at this University of Massachusetts, when a demented student snuck up and threw a pie in my face.
See, that's only second.
Was it good?
Preferable to dying on pilgrimage.
That's right.
Getting pied while talking about the avatar.
But I was in deep doo-doo at that point, when at least 500 of the people were angry as hell that they'd come out. They didn't know why they did. And they were seeing pictures of this guy, and people would ask questions like, that man, he's got Parkinson's disease. Going like this with his hand, And then somebody else came out and said, clearly you're a victim of sexual hysteria. They were grumbling and grousing.
Alan said, how'd you know?
They're very perspective. Then I got pied, and of course that changed everything. And I thought of...
It turned you into the underdog, and everyone loved it.
That's right. And I thought of Rick and Robert, and my first things coming out of my mouth after I knew I was alive instead of having been shot was, I said to the audience, my friends in Berkeley are going to love this. And in fact, that did turn them around. And they were very respectful afterwards. And there were letters in the student newspaper talking about how the skeptics had been converted. And, so the other one, classic was, of course, the Joe Pine Show on television, in which Rick and I participated, in which, and I'll get up to the punchline and give it over to Rick. He was probably the worst of the worst talk show guy of the old days.
Who remembers?
Oh, yeah.
He was great.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And
Really a wonderful deal.
we survived about 20 or 25 minutes without getting too nailed. He made some jokes about Baba talking to himself and things like that. But it wasn't that bad. But they had a secret witness in the audience. It was this very good-looking, very apparently well-spoken late graduate student from UCLA who was going to kind of cut us to the bone. And the audience, about 400 or 500 people, and they lived for the roadkill experience. And so this guy gets up to talk, and he didn't want to hear our message. That's him. And then, take it.
And then the event happened. You've told this story to everybody.
No.
Well, not everybody.
I don't remember. Tell me.
We're getting older.
The story doesn't end with this punchline, but it also can't begin here. We've got to go back to the guest that was on before we were.
Yes, you have to do that.
And that guest was a Cajun snake charmer. This is the kind of show this guy had. He had 3 guests per hour, a bunch of different wackos. Usually some wore, aluminum hats, and some were, Republican campaign managers. It was a wild batch of people. But this guy was a gay Cajun snake
Shaman with
dressed in
animals.
satin stuff and with a python and a dove in the same wicker basket. And so with this combination, it was an unusual combination even now, but then it was truly riveting. And the guy, he did his thing. What he did best was let Joe pet the python. And then one guy got up in the hot box, which was that place over there, and started to ask some questions. And I said, yeah, well, just here, I'm going to show you. And he put that python around the guy at the podium where the audience could ask questions, and the snake sort of slithered over this podium. And I'm sitting there looking at this thing, thinking, the last time I heard about snakes was walking through a village in India where the village head said, when Baba asked us to start a 30-day non-stop job, the day we began, 2 cobras appeared in the village, and we cabled Baba immediately, and he responded, don't worry about it, don't harm them, they are part of my work. At the end of 30 days, the 2 cobras disappeared. So I'm looking at this snake, and then at the end of this guy's session, and he's having trouble getting his act back in his basket. And one of the dove ends up on the burger, and we have to, the whole show comes to a halt. Can you get that bird down from me? All this is going on. They finally get the guy off, the snake off, and the dove off. And of course, dove is the universal symbol of peace. And all I can say is that in that show, Joe Pine, through no fault of ours, was pacified beyond any of our persuasion. He was extremely kind to us, and he just jumped on Phyllis Frederick and was as cruel and mean-spirited as could be in one later session. But with us, whom he could have probably just with the, he was an adept at killing people with his words, and he was very gentle. And then this guy gets up to make the case for LSD. He's a part-time aspiring actor and an LSD user and proponent, slumps in a faint in the middle of his exegesis. Well, I've taken quite a bit of LSD, and it really is. So, call it what you like, but Baba energized the scene.